Hello guys, once again it's Matt, and today we have another video. Thank you all the members, all the patrons. Make sure to subscribe. We are trying to hit 50,000 subscribers. We are almost at 20k, so help me out there. We can still do it before the end of the year, so let's go guys. So yeah, but let's talk about the video. So I wanted to do this video for a very long time actually, but it took actually a long time to just do the proper research on it. But it is to talk about the R-27ER. It is a kind of a controversial missile from the get-go when it was added because of two reasons. The first one is that it is considered a 90's missile, right? And the second thing is that the MiG-29 never used the ER and whatever, right? A lot of people always talk about that and they defend that it is Russian bias or anything like that. So I wanted to just clear the history of the missile a little bit and just the overall performance of the missile on the sense of what we need to counter it, because it is a very good missile, right? So first things first, let's talk about the history of the missile and the first argument that a lot of people say that it is a 90's missile. Well, that is actually not very true, right? So at the late 70s, the Vympel, or the Soviets in general, they were seeking for a development leading from the R-24 that was starting to get in operation in the late 70s, which, yeah, the R-24 you already know and love from the MiG-23s, right? And they wanted to do this missile because obviously they wanted to stay ahead from the West. And of course, the initial designs of the MiG-29 and the Su-27 had the idea of using the R-24 as a missile. Even versions of the MiG-31, some prototypes had this idea of trying to use something similar to that. But this idea was very shortly changed to use a new missile, which became the R-27. So that's the idea, right? The R-27 was made to be a missile that was to supersede the R-24. That's the initial idea. But they had a different idea because the way that everything is produced in the USSR, there is a lot of integration just due to the fact that everything is controlled by the government. Obviously, they don't have companies, or they didn't have, obviously they're not the Soviet Union anymore. They didn't have any companies, private-owned companies, right? So the government basically dictate what they had in mind for production. And that, it has its problems, but it has one good thing, at least on the sense of this particular missile, that they actually had an integration. So the idea, I already did a video talking about that, was that the program that actually started with the Su-27 and the other program that started with the MiG-29, they were meant to be integrated to each other in the battlefield. They were meant to be used together, with the MiG-29 in one place in the battlefield and the Su-27 in the other. The Su-27 would be a longer range escort/interceptor, right, for high altitudes and stuff. And the MiG-29 was meant to be a point defense interceptor / a light CAS aircraft. So it is more of a closer to the battlefield kind of situation. So it didn't have as much fuel, but it had a little bit more of acceleration and performance on that side. So one of them was escorting bombers and intercepting large bomber formations from like long distances, which is the Su-27, and the other would be a closer to the battlefield, fast interceptions from an airfield that is 100-200 kilometers from the border, right? So that was the idea. These two aircraft were meant to complement each other in the air defense role. Obviously, they decided to add each to their own missile as well. So that's where the catch comes from. So the R-27R and the T, or the normal ones, and the R-27Es, so the ER and EDs, they were developed together, okay? They are basically the same missile with a different engine. The idea was to use the normal R and Ds because they were lighter and the range on the radar was limited, so it wouldn't, ER, for example, wouldn't make it so that the MiG-29 could actually full exploit that range on the ER and ET, right? So the normal MiG-29s would use the R and Ts. And the Su-27, with its larger and more capable radar for longer engagements, longer ranges, right? It would use the ER and ET, also complementing that the ER and ET were a lot heavier, and the Su-27 was meant to be using a lot heavier equipment, right? So that was the initial idea behind these two missiles. One was for the MiG-29, one for the Su-27. The introduction of it they were basically done with that idea in mind. It was an idea that throughout the 80s it was used. So, especially because the ER were in shorter numbers, as well as the Su-27 compared to the MiG-29, right? But the missile itself, they're basically the same missile. The same pylon, kind of the same pylon. Obviously, it's a heavier, it's meant to be holding heavier stuff, right, on the ER, but still, it is, even to the pylon, it's similar. To the radar seeker is the same. The fins, the autopilot, everything is basically the same. The only main difference is the engine. It is like comparing the Skyflash to the Supertemp. They're the same missile, but they have a different engine. It's the same. The R and the ER are the same missile, but they have a different engine to fully utilize the ability of the Su-27 carrying the extra weight, and also the extra range that the ER being used better in the radar of the Su-27. So that was the idea. So dates here, first to actually mention the first myth, that this missile is actually from 1991 or 1990. A lot of sources claim that. So first of all, we need to talk about the development. And the development started in the middle to late 70s, and the first shot of both of these missiles were made in 1979 by a Su-15, modified Su-15, and a modified MiG-23 for carrying and testing those missiles. So that was the first shot for both the R-27R and R-27ER, 1979. Doesn't mean that the missile was in production and was basically in service in 1979. It was just the first shot. But from that onwards until 1983, they basically started producing in low numbers these missiles to be integrated in the new aircraft. Remember, 1980 marks the first Su-27S to actually come out of the factory for testing and stuff, and the MiG-29 as well. So both of the aircraft started to be rolled out of factory in 1980, the first ones. By 1983, the R-27R was already in the late developments in testing, right? So almost getting introduced, and the ER was actually still ongoing testing. It was a little bit delayed on the development due to the complexity of the Su-27's full digital systems and stuff like that. It was a little bit more complex than the MiG-29, so it was a little bit harder to make the missile work. And as I said, the ER is made for the Su-27. So, you know, of course, the objective was to be used on that. Another thing is that in 1983, I mean, the R was already entering semi-service, right? The ER was being still shot in testing. So the numbers that I have is that they made basically 60 missiles from 1979 to 1983, shooting 39 of them in testing. In 1984, that basically went back into the factory, and they redesigned everything that needed to be redesigned in the software department and everything else to be able to be used. And around 1984 to 87, it was basically used in squadrons, but for testing as well. How do I say that it's hard to find information on where exactly the first squadron received the first ER for actual use? But as I said, from 1984 onwards, it started to be used. The first actual evidence that we have that was already in squadrons is a 1987 picture of a P-3 Orion that was intercepted by an Su-27P from the PVO that actually was using the ERs. So it's basically complicated to know if it was if it was used before in squadrons or not. But between 1984 and 87, doesn't matter too much, it's only 3 years. It was started to be used in squadrons. 87, as I said, the evidence says that it was already being used in combat squadron in combat missions, intercepting foreign aircraft. So, yes, it's already in service technically. Obviously, things change, and obviously, official numbers always are different from the squadrons, you know. The thing is that even though the missile was in service, the Communist Party only accepted into full service in their own books, for example, inside the government, as in 1990 and 1991, right? But it kind of doesn't matter. This is just an official paper kind of situation, right? The missile was already in service. I mean, it was being used in missions already, right? So it kind of doesn't matter what the politicians say. The missile was already in service and being used by the BBO. So that's the first thing. It is, yes, early 80s, mid 80s missile. Of course, if a war went out and a war broke out, we would see these missiles being deployed faster, but we didn't, so everything was according to plan. I can say, if you want, you can say, obviously, in 1985 we have the official entering service, kind of the Su-27. And the thing is that around 1985 they already had like 200, 300 Su-27s, and they were using the R-27ER as well. So it is, I would say that if you want to be official about it, you can say that it's a mid-80s aircraft, a missile, an aircraft with the Su-27. So that's the time frame that we normally see. These are from Gordon Yeffing's books, mainly, you know, so there's a lot of information there. I managed to find also that, for example, the Su-27, there is a misconception that the S variant never carried the R-77, for example, only the SM. But there is this book on the Su-27 from Gordon that he basically mentions that very late production models of the Su-27 got the extra 2 pilots that the Su-33 had, and the ability to carry the R-77. So, but it is hard to find information on it. Of course, Gaijin, when they are going to add this type of thing, they have a larger research team than we do. We are only few people researching here and there and getting some information that might not be even right. So I normally try to trust them more, because normally I find something on the internet and then I think it's true, and then I do a book report and they show that it's not true. So normally they have a better team than I personally do, right? Obviously. So it's not that you need to like take it everything that Gaijin does, but they tend to have a more realistic view than we from the internet, without going to museums, without going to manuals and stuff, can normally, you know. That's just pretty much it. And the fact that the MiG-29 also used the ER, it is just kind of a, I mean, it's a situation that it's hard to find in books and stuff. So you can argue that if you want to have a realistic 80s MiG-29, it wouldn't use the R. But the thing is that these aircraft were even later modified to be the SMTs, right? So they are still in service until this day, these 912s and 913s that we have in game. Not the German ones, but the Soviet ones, you know? So the missile is the same. There's nothing that says that the missile cannot be used on the MiG. And it probably was used because it is the same missile. So it is probably a retrofit kinda situation that happened in the 90s. I would agree with that. But still doesn't matter, that it doesn't mean that the MiG-29 never used the ER. It did use it. We just don't know when exactly, because things are foggy from certain areas of the Soviet military service. As I said, from 1984 to 1987, we cannot know for sure when the first ER in squadron operations was ever used, right? So some things you have to just, it's around that area, you know? And not just go for a very, like, nerdy even kind of way of looking at dates as the only thing that matters, you know. So that's why I think the R-27ER is fair enough to be added to the game, and it's fair enough to be added to the MiG-29. It doesn't mean that I agree with the balance right now. I still think that the F-16C should have been added instead of the A to be the counter of these MiG-29s, especially the Block 30 or maybe a 25 that could carry the AIM-7P or AIM-7MH. It would make it, I mean, the missiles would still have the same energy as the normal AIM-7s that we already have in game, but at least it would have inertial navigation and data link and stuff that would make the Sparrow missiles a little bit more reliable than they are right now, with better radars like the APG-68. So that would help bridge the gap in the BVR department against the MiG-29s. But it doesn't mean that the MiG-29 shouldn't receive the ER. I think the R is fine, but it's more of a problem of the F-16 than a problem of having the ER, in my opinion. But anyway, let me know in the comments what you think about this. As I said, kind of controversial and kind of a long video, but I needed to do this. As I said, all my sources, I cannot actually show them, sorry about that, just because it is copyrighted, because they are books that are sold, right? But if you want any biography or, basically books that you can read, find anything with Gordon Yeffins on the S-27, on the Yaks, on the MiG-29. The MiG-29 book that I normally use have 500 pages of every single version of the MiG-29 described on it. And it's pretty much very, very reliable. It's one of the most reliable sources out there for civilian use, right? So, yes, these are all from Gordon Yeffins normally, or for some manual or anything like that that I have, like a Russian pilot handbook for the MiG-29 or anything like that, right? It's a lot of things that I have to read about this, so make sure to subscribe, click the like button, and I see you guys on the next one. Bye guys, see you.